pick up, and then...
Alright.
Are you on my dad's lobster diving?
Yeah.
No, we've been 20 minutes ago, just talking about lobsters.
Hi everyone.
Hey, Chad.
For those of you who don't know me very well, I'm Hero, but I'm friends to most of you here, and I hope to be friends to the rest of you that are here. I started doing this series at my apartment called the Lecture Series. I don't have a name for it, so feel free to pitch one to me.
Glorious.
Not right now. And ideally they would happen every week on Saturdays. The reason that I'm doing this is because, like many of you, I have a lot of friends in a lot of disciplines at UCLA, and I have a lot of good conversation with them, and I wanted everyone to have access to these conversations and to be thinking along these different lines in a way that I feel we don't have access to in our classes. I study comparative literature and I also study math. And in both of these classes, I felt sort of shoehorned away from the other side of my studies. And that's been sort of frustrating to me. I feel like humanities at UCLA doesn't prioritize their value as much as they should, and the STEM community at UCLA definitely sometimes thinks that it's separate from the humanities. To put it lightly. And I found this out really clearly when I was taking a class on evolutionary biology, or the history of evolutionary biology. It was a GE credit, and we were learning all this stuff about whatever, bio's not my thing, cells,
Cells, made up of
things inside cells, I'm sure. And at the time I was taking math, we were doing a lot of proofs.
Yeah.
So of course my immediate question was like, how do we know all of this? Like, how am I supposed to believe it if I didn't see it? How am I supposed to believe it if I didn't get the information that led to it? And the joke that arose from that was that I don't believe in evolution, which I went around saying to people to sort of, as you can imagine, mixed results. A lot of people jumped to the conclusion that I was an evangelical Christian, and a lot of people thought I was stupid or contrary for no reason. But not many people really paused to consider that the same statement is often said of art by many tech bros, that they don't believe in art, that they don't believe art has value. I just watched Julian Donkey Boy. So many people would say that they don't like things that are, quote, Werner Herzog's artsy fartsy. And that really showed me that a dialogue needs to be opened up across all of the disciplines that we've brought here today. And that brings me to my friend Bogdan.
Yeah! Let's freaking go.
Bogdan is one of the people that brings, I would say, as much or more passion that I do to literature and the arts, but he brings it to many different fields, not least of which is math and computer science. I think he's one of the only computer science engineers that I know who really adores the field and is doing it because they adore the field and not because it's a very secure field. And I think that's admirable. Among his other interests are Wikipedia and history and philosophy. I think you can see the culmination of those factors on the screen right now.
I like basically everything though, so just like...
So, with that, I will let him take it from here. Please welcome Bogdan Yaremenko.
Alright, so as a little disclaimer, so when I kind of set out to make this presentation, I was like, okay, it's going to be about like Gödel's Incompleteness theorem, and I'm going to be doing a lot about kind of the historical like context surrounding it, kind of what it meant for like maybe like philosophy and like just the greater like cultural context of its time. As I was doing more research, the kind of, as so often happens in such things, oh my God, Sid, hi! But as so often happens in such, matters, I realized that the statement of the theorem, there's a lot of things that people have said that are kind of dubiously like linked to it, and the actual statement of the theorem is like not as like all-encompassing as some people kind of like think it to be. However, it is still a very interesting result, and it still does, I think it is still very interesting to interpret it in a sort of like aesthetic and like historical lens. And there's going to be a lot in the beginning of kind of like history of math stuff, just because I feel like it's, well, one, it's just kind of interesting, at least I hope I present it in a way that makes it interesting, but also two, I mean, it's like important for understanding like what these theorems actually mean, and like, what why was everyone kind of freaked out about this? Like what did this guy prove that was like so crazy? So yeah, without further ado, let's go on. Okay, so chapter 1, the storm is brewing. So yeah, we're just gonna talk about, you know, everything that preceded this. So yeah. All right, so I think this is a valid question to ask, because I think there is a sort of very intuitive notion of math that is like prevalent, that's kind of just like, okay, well, math is just kind of about, I mean, it's about numbers, right? It's about numbers. What can you do with numbers? Like, you know, equations and stuff like that. Like, generally, there's, you know, like, and for, I think a lot of people really never get outside of this sort of intuitive context of math. Like, really, because you go up to like calculus, and that's pretty much everything that you like, you know, at least if you're not like going in some like further math direction that's like, you know, very math focused, like pretty much you just get to like calculus, maybe some differential equations, and just this sort of like computational stuff where you're basically just given like a theorem or like a formula or something, and you're just kind of like, okay, well, this works, cool, like this is true, great. But there is very much like a notion of math, and like this is the exact kind of notion that like was used, for example, by like the Egyptians and like the Babylonians. Like they had a pretty like decently strong like math background. Like, you know, they had the Pythagorean theorem, like they figured that out. They had a decent bit of knowledge about this. But the thing is, they didn't really have a particular thing that the Greeks really just kind of invented, which is, you know, I mean, there's a lot of things you can say are kind of like, you know, oh, these people invented this, like, oh, it's like Eurocentric, but this is one of those cases where you can actually say that they pretty much uniquely came up with this, which is very interesting, or at least, you know, within like the context of like history that we know. So just as a little bit of context of like, okay, why, you know, where did this come from? So basically, Greece is, you know, there are a bunch of these little islands, and it's really hard for you to kind of have like a unified like political structure across all of these islands. So, you know, this is why you had all these like different city-states and all this. And it was also unique in the sense that like you had this very lucrative trade of like olive oil and things like this that like are not really, there's a lot of labor that goes into like making them, and they're also pretty like unique to, well, not unique perhaps, but like you can make it in Greece, and basically the sale of these products supported like a large like middle class sort of like, you know, people that like had some sort of like excess, you know, time. But not only this, it also meant that like, you know, because in addition to this like decentralized kind of nature of it, you kind of ended up having this phenomenon where people would just argue like a lot, like constantly. Like they would just, you know, you'd go from island to island, and there's this big sort of like public spectacle basically of debate where like you would have like someone would like come up onto the stage and say like, okay, I say that like everything is made of fire. And then basically other people would come up and like try to come up with arguments to like refute that, and then your purpose is to kind of like, you know, defend yourself against these arguments. And this is very much like a public spectacle. Like this is kind of like a arena kind of situation. So this is really where you get the foundations of what we would call, I suppose, like pure math, the sort of like axiomatic, and I'll define what an axiom is, system of mathematics that really like modern mathematics like traces its like lineage to. And so we really see a super famous like textbook in just the history of like mathematics. Like this is like perhaps like the textbook of like all time in mathematics is like Euclid's Elements. And if you read it, it's very interesting because it kind of goes through this very like step-by-step process of like establishing certain like diagrams and like things that you can draw in geometry. So basically, like if he talks about something like an equilateral triangle, he will like very much precisely establish what you need to do to get an equilateral triangle, and like only once he establishes this notion will he like move on to something else. And this is very interesting because it goes back to this like sort of debate field where like, okay, lots of these like philosophers were able to like, present their arguments and stuff like that, but mathematics truly emerged as this thing that like, if you establish these certain like held truths, then like everything that you kind of deduced from those like particular held truths was then sort of like irrefutable, because I mean, all your arguments were based on true things that you could demonstrate, like you demonstrate to the crowd. Literally, you like can draw like an equilateral triangle, which I'll show the process for that in a second. But basically, like, and everything is built off of this, which very much differed it from like other philosophies that might have been more empirical, where it's like, I mean, if you say that like everything's made of fire, then like show me, right? But it's not as easy to do in front of an audience as like, okay, here's my argument for why like a circle is this or something, right? So so basically mathematics was like very much viewed in this like notion of like this like higher truth, basically. And there's like even schools of people that are like dedicated to like, that like thought mathematics was this like ultimate truth. Okay, so yeah, sorry, this is gonna be a couple. So basically, this is just kind of demonstrate like what I mean when I was talking about like the equilateral triangle thing, where it's like it very much is this like formal process that like developed through like many like hundreds of years to like prove this like certain thing. So if you keep going, basically you start with this circle, and you have like two items basically, like you have a compass and a ruler, and you can draw another circle, on the to intersect with its like center in the middle on the radius of that circle. And then you see that like this is now kind of a line that is the exact length of it is this radius, and you can keep going. And then you put in another point up there, and then boom, you can kind of see that like this has to be an equilateral triangle because well these two circles intersect up here, and then you also drew this circle to make sure that it was on the radius of this circle. So all of these like lines have to be equal. And so basically, he would like it would kind of be like whenever he like writes equilateral triangle in some kind of proof that he's doing, it would kind of be like you can kind of think of like Wikipedia, like there's a hyperlink to it and you can go to it, right? Like you can see where it is. So yeah. And so fast forwarding, thousands of years. So this sort of like, you could consider that like triangle, like there's certain things that Euclid basically designated to be like axioms, which are like things that basically you like establish from the outset that are these like formal properties that you derive everything from. And so the kind of unique thing that the Greeks did is that they made this sort of like, they made mathematics into this like deductive system where instead of like making observations and then making inferences about those observations, you instead start with like a set of rules and you like make logical sort of like deductions from that set of rules. And this is why I was talking about all the Greek stuff, because they were the ones who really like invented that basically. And so obviously time passes and we get to the 18th century or the 19th century. Now what really happens at this point is that you start to get people that realize that like, okay, turns out there's actually like other systems that we can have, because the whole idea of these axioms is they were based on sort of like very like intuitive notions that like everybody could agree upon to be true. For example, like if you have 2 points, you can make a line through them, right? But people start to realize that like you could make systems that were like didn't include certain like base axioms that like Euclid included, that were also entirely like consistent and like valid systems that like provided interesting results. So so one example of this is that like, okay, in Euclid's axioms there's this thing called like the parallel line postulate, which basically says like, okay, I don't remember the exact statement, but basically it's what allows you to like draw a square. And people basically realize that like, hey, if you have some sort of like curved space that like maybe doesn't necessarily like follow this parallel line postulate, then you can follow the same process for drawing a square as you would, otherwise, but suddenly it turns out to be, it's not a square anymore. What is this? It's not, that's not, like, you drew 3 right angles, but this obviously isn't a right angle, so like what's going on here? And so this kind of started to like eat at people a little bit. So people started to think of mathematics as like, okay, maybe there is some kind of truth, but like we have to do like a little bit more digging, or like maybe there are like certain systems in which, and basically this started to really like tug at people, like at mathematicians, and they started to be like, okay, we really need to like figure out some like firm footing for this. And so this basically led to, this takes us to around the end of the 19th century and this guy called Georg Cantor. Now, Cantor, his deal was that basically he found this proof that there are strictly more real numbers, which real numbers are like numbers that are like the square root of 2 or like pi or like, and it includes everything else. Like it includes fractions and like, integers and, or I mean like just like, counting numbers like 1, 2, 3, 4, whatever. It includes all of that, but it also includes like the square root of 2. Whereas the natural numbers are literally just like counting numbers, just like 1, 2, 3, 4, whatever. And you can kind of see how like, okay, you can form like a one-to-one sort of like correspondence between natural numbers on one hand and like integers. Like if I give you a natural number, you can give me an integer and like vice versa, basically. Like you can, and Cantor is basically thinking about this in terms of like the size of like the natural numbers, because the thing is, if you can prove that there's a real number that's like not in correspondence with any other natural number, then you can prove that like the size of the real numbers in some sense is bigger than the size of the natural numbers. And so you can see here that like it's fine with the integers, and then even with the rational numbers, which are just fractions basically, even here you can kind of define a way where it goes through each of them. Where like this is 1, this is 2, this is 3, this is 4, this is 5, this is 6, whatever. But very crucially, with the set of all like rational numbers, there's this kind of proof. I can go a little bit of the details into it, but basically, what you do is you take. I don't know if you guys are like familiar with like binary. Like you can basically just like represent any number in terms of like ones and zeros. I don't know. Yeah. Okay, I'm getting some nods. I don't know. Well, basically, these are just like numbers, right? And you can like assign like, and this is basically like, imagine if you like put a dot here basically, and you said these are all like decimals. And so the idea is that like no matter, and like let's say for each natural number you assign some like random string of like ones and zeros. Crucially, like they're all unique, so that you assign some like unique like string of like ones and zeros. And like that's like a real number, right? And then the thing is, what you can do there is you can now define a new real number that crucially has every single one of these like places like flipped. So like wherever it has like a 0, like along the diagonal here. So wherever it has a 0 here, it'll have like a 1 here. Wherever it has like a 1 here, it'll have a 0 here. And by doing this, you can basically create a real number that won't be, like it can't fall into any of these like natural numbers that we're counting here, because it's like by construction it's kind of designed to be that way. And so this really starts to get into what we call the foundational crisis in mathematics, because people start to think, because for a while infinity was kind of thought to be this like realm of like philosophy, and it's like, okay, we don't really have an infinity, like what do we do with that, But here Cantor just showed that like actually there's kind of like a different kind of infinity in a sense, because like, okay, natural numbers, real numbers, there's both infinitely many of them, but somehow, in some sense, there's more real numbers than natural numbers. So people start to get really freaked out about it. This caused a lot of controversy. People were not super happy about this. And if we keep going, basically, like, this is what leads to, this is the symbol for real numbers, and this is the symbol for natural numbers. So basically he's saying that like the number of real numbers is bigger than, and here's Cantor. Anyway. Okay, so basically this is what leads to this formulation of this thing called like set theory, where sets are basically just like a collection of things. Like all of us in the room, you could consider that a set. Like, I don't know, 1, 2, 3, that's a set. And you can kind of see here, like, this is bad picture on purpose maybe, but like anyway, and he starts to like formulate this thing called set theory. But the thing is, and like people start to think, okay, this is we can work with this, like, okay, maybe it's like a good foundation. And especially this guy called Gottlieb Frege, I think that's his name, he has this like very logical standpoint on mathematics, and he really has this program where he thinks that you can turn all the rules of logic into mathematics, basically. Like you can or rather, I guess you can, no, it's more the other way around, that you can turn mathematics into logic. And so he has this whole program, and he like writes this big thing, but then you have this issue where literally in a letter, this guy Bertrand Russell is like, dude, there's like a contradiction at the base of your thing, and it's completely like invalid. And so that's why this is now called like naive set theory basically, because it includes this one, one aspect in there that like just kind of screws up the whole thing. So, okay, so this is like a very like, this is me trying to have an example of like what exactly this paradox was that caused this sort of dissolution, because I think it's pretty interesting to just know, maybe the exact details of it aren't super relevant, but I think it is interesting. So basically, this is like the classic sort of like barbershop metaphor that people use. So there's like the three kind of like rules of this island, right? Everyone has a fresh cut. No one can cut their own hair, because that's stupid. But there's only one barber. Okay, so where does this take us? So then we ask the question, okay, so obviously, okay, normally this works fine. Okay, you have some, some dude here, and Julian here is cutting his hair. Okay, cool. Yeah. But then we ask the question, so what happens? Like, who cuts the barber's hair? Because, okay, let's say the barber cuts his hair, but that contradicts the fact that, everybody, like, you can't cut your own hair, right? But if the barber doesn't cut his own hair, well, his hair has to be cut, and there's only one barber. So you kind of lead to, like, a contradiction. And this is kind of relevant, like, the sort of set formulation of this is like, okay, if you have the set of all sets that do not contain themselves, and you consider that, like, you ask the question of like, okay, is that set a member of itself? And then you kind of come to a contradiction there. So it's basically just like a similar kind of thing. Okay, so, you might be thinking, okay, well, you found some one random, like, little contradiction in some theory. Like, okay, why is that so important? Like, okay, like, I just won't make a set like that then, like, whatever. But unfortunately, there is this thing called the principal explosion, which basically, it's a pretty radical name, I know, which basically means that, like, whenever you find a contradiction in some logical theory, it kind of causes the whole thing to fall apart. So okay, if both are true, so we're setting up a contradiction here, basically. All Chinese restaurants are shocked when white boy orders in perfect zhongwen. And there exists a Chinese restaurant that is, they don't really care that much, they're fine. This is a negation of the earlier statement. So then we kind of have this issue where, okay, we can make this statement of all Chinese restaurants are shocked, or I have $1 billion. Now, this is a true statement because this, we already said, is true, yes? However, okay, we've established this is a true statement, but we also know that the negation of this is true. So, if we say that this is false, which it is, according to this, then the only way the statement can be true is to say that I have $1 billion. Which, I don't know. Maybe. Who knows? Okay, so yeah, basically, this is the big sort of issue that really gets us to our main topic here, which is, Gödel's Incompleteness theorem and, the sort of implications and like where it came from and all that. So, this is kind of a cheeky way to say, too, like using set theory, because there's a way you can formulate the natural numbers using sets. Anyway. Foundational crisis. Uh-oh. No, that's all. Okay, so there we go, our boy David Hilbert. So don't worry, guys, Hilbert has a plan. Yep, I think that's him. So, so basically, David Hilbert, his whole kind of deal is like, he thinks that, okay, he wants to find a way, and this guy's very like, I'll explain kind of, maybe some of you guys like have a sense of like what modernism means already, but I would say that his approach is like kind of modernist in the way that like he thinks about mathematics. He thinks that basically this whole business about like it being like potentially incomplete or whatever, like he thinks that there's a way that we can kind of just make like mathematics is just fundamentally just a bunch of like symbols about like statements, and that if we go about this a certain way, we can kind of just end up like proving all of like mathematics through this very like systematic notion just that's based on just like literally like combinations of these symbols. And so this is called kind of like formalism. Like, cause like, you know, you can talk about like the set of all natural numbers or like stuff like that, right? But at the end of the day, like we're just writing down, you know, n, whatever, like it's, at the end of the day, we're using finite language to talk about infinite things. So his idea is like, okay, well, you know, what if we use like, you know, the fact that the language we use is finite, and we kind of make some kind of way to like, we make some proof that like, basically you can give an algorithm to like find every provable statement in a given theory. And so, yeah, and so basically he has this lecture where he poses this like main question of, you know, let's find an algorithm to find like a complete mathematics, basically. And so, yeah, this is the first question he posed. Ah, shoot. So, yeah, so it turns out, you know, I thought it was number 1, but it turns out it's actually a different one, which, you know, it actually kind of reminds me of another situation where something that was number 2 was actually supposed to be number 1. I don't know, it kind of reminds me of something here. But the first one is actually interesting because it relates to like the thing that we were talking about before, but we don't need to get too sidetracked. Yeah. Okay, so Hilbert. By the way, this is the Pokemon thing is because this guy's named Hilbert. He is actually named after David Hilbert, which I found that kind of funny. But anyway, so yeah, so basically, if Hilbert's program, as it's called, if it actually like came to fruition, all of mathematics would kind of be reduced into this process of like you could just start with a set of rules, and you could start and like based on that set of rules, you could then just like kind of give it to a computer, and the computer would then like find every single combination of those rules, and then every single combination it found would then be a theorem. And since the only rules that the computer found, those are the only like true statements, then you would then just be able to generate all of mathematics just from a computer, just through a root process. And so in a way, I guess it's kind of good that, you know, it ended up being that Gödel ended up dropping a massive freaking bomb onto all of this, because, you know, math would literally just end up being kind of solved. So, yeah. Okay, so basically the bomb that Gödel dropped into Hilbert's whole program is called the Incompleteness theorem, and it is actually kind of interesting because Gödel himself like was a fan of this program, and he thought, you know, he was not actively really working to like undermine it. He thought that, you know, it is maybe true, and like he had his own kind of ideas about math, but like, you know, generally everyone at the time thought that this was like a plausible idea, and like, you know, yeah, like obviously, because kind of an example of like a metaphor I would give for his whole program is he's saying, okay, if you have a chessboard and you have all the starting, you know, pawns and like positions on the chessboard, and you have all the rules of chess, then if someone gives you like a random position on the board, you should be able to figure out, you know, that, okay, is this a valid position or not? Like, could you actually get to this, right? But turns out, in this particular case of, you know, like arithmetic like theory, you can. So this is basically what Godel proved, and this is what we'll get into here. Now, I guess we've done a lot of foundations, but these are the foundations specifically for this particular proof. Okay, so first of all, the first little thing that like Godel found that was like particularly, I guess, novel for the time, but like now we kind of have an intuitive sense of this just because of the computers, is that he kind of thought about, okay, we have all these like symbols and all this logic and stuff like that. Why don't we just find a way to like encode them all into like numbers? Because this is kind of like the proof, like the proof kind of uses this like self-referential thing, and you can't like refer to like things within a theory as numbers if you don't like provide a way to like establish them as such. So he comes up with this thing called like the Godel numbering or the Godel coding, and it's very similar to like if you take a computer, right? Everything in a computer is just literally it's just strings of like ones and zeros, right? So it's very similar to that in a way where it's like, okay, if you open like some Google Doc or something, it's like, okay, it's all words on a page, but to the computer, it's just numbers. It's just numbers. And so he comes up with a similar sort of scheme, but for like mathematical statements. And not only does he provide just like this particular scheme, but he provides a scheme to like transform everything into this method. He proves that basically. And so this is where it gets a little complicated, but bear with me here. So this is basically a lemma that we're gonna like about to, and like don't feel bad if this is, I'm still trying to like figure this out myself. It's a little confusing, but basically this is the thing that like allows the theorem to function. So if you take any like just like any arbitrary like formula of numbers that has one variable, which we'll call phi, then basically this lemma states that like in whatever like theory we're working in T that has like elements of arithmetic, there is a sentence C or psi, people call it C, whatever, we'll call it psi, that such that psi and this sort of, and these kind of brackets mean that this is like the Godel numbering of psi. This is like the kind of encoding, because C is like a formula with like one variable, phi is a formula with one variable, and so if this is just a number, then we can plug this into this formula, right? And so basically this lemma states that like for every sort of formula that has one variable, we can produce like a statement, like a sentence, such that this like statement is only true if this formula is true with this like statement inserted. Yeah, and so this is where you kind of get this like capacity for like self-reference. Also, I should have said this earlier, but anyone feel free to like ask any questions.
What is a Godel code?
Okay, so this is what we were talking about before, basically, where like you can, because you can take this like, you can take anything that's like, this is like what Godel came up with basically, where like you can take any sort of like mathematical like symbols or like any sort of like mathematical formulation, and you can assign it to a number, like a unique number. So for example, like 3 plus 4, you can like, that will like factor into like certain numbers that like you can then, like that statement will have like a unique identity basically. And so this is basically, we're saying that like there exists a sentence such that its unique identity, when plugged into this formula, this will have the same truth value as the sentence itself. Which is, it's kind of weird to think about, but I think it might make more sense once we go on to the actual theorem. Okay, so this is basically, this is the actual statement like of the first theorem. So if we take, if we take our phi, the sort of formula that we were talking about earlier, that only that has, it's like of one variable, then if we take that to be just the statement basically that like x is provable, whatever x is, and you can formulate that like within like mathematical language in this theory basically, then that lemma that we were just discussing earlier means that the negation of this formula, which is like another sort of formula you can make, there exists a sentence where the truth value, like this sentence being true, is the same as like the number of this sentence, like being, like this formula being valid with like the number of this sentence basically.
Does anyone want him to repeat that slowly?
Yeah, sorry. So if you take, okay,
that's your phi at the top left. That's
yes,
your phi formula.
yes,
Okay.
yes. And so because the lemma we were discussing earlier basically means that like there exists this like sentence, this like statement basically, that if you plug it into this formula, it's the same, like this side being true is the same as this statement being true.
So for example, 3 plus 4, if
Yeah.
you plug that in, you would get on the other side.
Yeah, so basically, yeah, so if this, like, for example, if our like kind of statement here was like 3 plus x, and then we had it over here as like 3 plus x, then there would be some statement that's like 3 plus psi is the same as psi, like that being true, or like 3 plus the encoding of psi is the same as like psi being true. It's a little bit funky. I'm not sure of like a better way to explain this. I think we can just move past it. Yeah, but basically, the reason this kind of like what we get from this basically is that like, okay, well, if we take this to be okay, the statement that like x is like not provable because this is what this like not symbol means, then this statement means the same as like, well then this is saying that like psi is not provable basically. And this is saying that it's the same thing as, this has the same truth value as like psi itself. And so if we say that like, okay, well, that means that like, okay, well, let's say that psi is like false then, that like psi, or like this statement is false, that like psi is provable. Well then, okay, but that makes this whole statement like false, so then this ends up, so then psi is provable. So that's kind of a contradiction. Like something can't be provable and then you can prove like this is like, you can prove within the theory that like psi is provable then. And so because of this, like psi must be true. And like this statement must be true. So the statement that like psi is not provable must be true, because otherwise you get a contradiction. And then basically that means that we have this like true statement, because we just argued that it's true, that says that there is a sentence that you can't prove. And so basically, sorry, the reasoning here is like kind of, I don't fully get it myself, so I don't know. But anyway, the main point is that you can basically have this statement, we've proven that you can have like this mathematical truth that is not provable. You can't, basically if you have the chessboard and you just follow the rules of like, you know, how the pawns move and everything, you end up, like, you can't get to this point. Like there's no way you can like prove this. But it's true, which is really weird to think about. Like what's the deal with that? Like how can something be true but also not provable? And so, yeah, this is kind of just going through the logic there. And so, okay, so this kind of causes a big, you know, hubbub, because it's like, okay, well, how can you have true statements in mathematics that are not provable? And this basically, this is the reason why this kind of disproves Hilbert's whole program, is because that means you can't just have a computer churning out proofs, because you never get to the truth of that statement. Like you never get to that statement that's true, because by definition you can't prove it. You can't have a computer that churns out proofs that like finds it, right? So basically that kind of undermines that whole like view of mathematics as something that's like complete, and complete meaning, oh, I never explained the whole incompleteness part. So incomplete, like here, basically meaning that like there are true statements in the theory that you can't prove. And by the way, this was proved in like a lot of generalities. So basically every system of mathematics that like includes some notion of like arithmetic, like basically like the most simple stuff you can do, it will have this problem. So yeah. And so yeah, now let's talk about, okay, what does this mean? So yeah, it caused a lot of sort of like, it continues to cause, you know, a certain degree of like uncertainty in mathematics, because, okay, I mean, you have this like, let's say you have, okay, this like Goldbach conjecture that basically says every even number greater than 2 or something is like the sum of 2 primes. And so this conjecture is saying like, and this is like a statement that still hasn't been proven. Like people think it's true, but no one's ever found a proof for it, and people are continuing to work on this like problem. And the thing is, this incompleteness theorem basically, drops a hole out of your whole, like, maybe you spent your life working on this one problem, and it turns out within the system that you're working in, you can't prove it. So it's just kind of like it kind of erodes at like this like foundation of like certainty that like mathematics really used to have. Like, I mean, it really was that like one science that like was certain, like 2 + 2 is always 4. Like, ideas about like the 4 humors might have turned into like, modern medicine, and like lots of theories have changed, but like theorems always stay the same. So, the fact that there's this sort of like foundational sort of like issue, I guess, in mathematics is just very, very strange. And obviously there's like physics, for example, is like all based on like, mathematical thinking and that sort of thing. So causes, if you think about it too hard, it's like, okay, well, what does this mean for the rest of science? Like, are there truths in science that we will never be able to prove or like find because of like similar reasons to like, to the incompleteness theorem? And so this kind of takes me to the whole conception of like, the whole postmodernism part, modernism, and we were talking about that, or I did mention that I was going to talk about this. So this is where it gets a little more comprehensible, I think. So modernism is basically, just for like a show of hands, like I'm a little curious. I want to see first of all, how many of you have like heard of just like modernism before, and just like, as like an aesthetic concept? Okay, cool. Does anyone want to give me like a working definition of like what because it's a very vague sort of, concept, but like I feel like a lot of people have like different ideas of what it means. Anyone willing to like just shoot me a definition, or like just, something?
I understand it as like hard work is like the only key to like knowledge and like progress, and like you can always build like bigger systems in a sense.
Mm-hmm.
Like a big valued work.
Yeah.
I would say that like a lot of modernist art tends to question foundational concepts or like principles that other people took for granted. So, for example, modernist literature often has experimental forms.
Yeah. I would agree. And so,
And also in terms of architecture, like stuff that kind of on the same day, stuff that hasn't really been tried before, and stuff that I generally find looks cool, but
so central to modernism is this sort of like critique of like Enlightenment, sort of like, oh, we like know everything, or like we maybe not that we like know everything, but like at least the processes that like we have in motion will lead us to like know everything. And modernism basically says that, okay, obviously it's like a very broad cultural sort of like phenomenon, so it is hard to like give it like one particular like definition, but that's kind of why I had you guys give me some definitions, because it is such a broad sort of thing, but you guys all kind of get this central sort of like theme going here that like, everything in modernism generally, it's like you do question everything, but it's to get to a point. So a lot of modern architecture kind of has, you kind of see it like rising to like a point, some sort of like apex, some sort of like ultimate, maybe not ultimate truth, but some sort of truth that can eventually be achieved through this like continued process. And so, funnily enough, one of my favorite definitions of modernism came from this review of a PT Cruiser that I watched. It's a great channel, regular car reviews, big fan. But yeah, this is his kind of, he's like an English, he's like an English professor, and now he just reviews cars. It's really fun.
It seems kind of like the definition of modernism you're going to is just like Kant, like everything after Immanuel Kant. That's kind of the way I think of it sometimes, and like especially this.
Yeah.
I don't know if that.
Yeah. It's very like, past like, post like 19th century, or it really develops into its own thing. Like I would agree. Like I don't have a great like, understanding of like everything. I'm not like a philosophy major, but I like the things that I've heard about like what he's said that kind of lines up with what I'm thinking. Yeah. Yeah. Okay, and so this kind of takes us to like, okay, postmodernism, and I promise I'll relate all this to like math in a second, but maybe you can already kind of see where this is going. Postmodernism is very much, you know, I've heard it commonly defined as like the era of postmodernism is kind of, you know, after the bomb drops in like World War II, and everybody kind of looked at the world and saw, okay, we have all this stuff that can just be erased immediately. What if, you know, and everything is kind of just, you know, in front of us in a sense. And there's another definition I've seen that kind of expresses an interesting way in that it kind of is modernism like feeding back on itself, where modernism, you know, tries to question everything to like get to like a higher truth, but then almost in a sense it starts questioning. Postmodernism is when modernism even starts questioning itself, and then you kind of end up in this like self-referential kind of like cycle where it's like, okay, well, you know, maybe truth is just kind of whatever's here, you know. And so you see this in sort of I took some examples of like postmodern architecture that are kind of just, you know, people just threw whatever onto a building, and you know, it's kind of cool, I guess. Sure. And yeah, and you know, you even have like the PT Cruiser. Yeah, there you go. It's postmodern. It's, you know, it's kind of just, it's, the truth is, you know, okay, we have this like weird old looking car, but it's here. It's, you know, and so like generally, or what are you saying? Oh, okay. And generally, people think of actually, I read a whole like thesis on like people saying that like Gödel, like, you know, being like was like this like a very modernist undertaking, like the incompleteness theorem. And in some sense, I agree with that in the sense that like you know, obviously he like questioned this like very foundational thing, and like he got this like higher result. But I feel like in some sense, and also like Gödel is very thoroughly placed like in the years of like modernism that are like after World War I and like before World War II, where it was like at its height. But I still would make the argument that like his kind of results were postmodern in a way, where he kind of ushered in this like new era where, you know, there's this like fundamental like uncertainty within math, and you know, at some level you kind of just have to like keep going, and obviously mathematicians still do math. And actually it's pretty interesting how they still do, because like, you know, there are certain results that like you can't prove, right? And there's certain statements that like we can't even decide, like, you know, there's like proofs for things like you remember how we just talked about the real numbers and the natural numbers? Well, there's this sort of like central thing in mathematics, the central problem of this like continuum hypothesis, which is basically saying, okay, if there's more real numbers than natural numbers, is like the size of the real numbers, is that the next biggest thing after the natural numbers, or is it like, is there something in between? And so the continuum hypothesis is basically saying that like the real numbers are the next biggest thing. But the thing is, there isn't really a conclusive, like, there isn't like a proof of it. Like, and in fact, it's one of those things that's kind of been determined to be like undecidable. Or actually, I don't remember if that one in particular has been. But generally, what people do is they like set up a system where like, okay, this thing is true, and let's see what happens from there. And then they also set up a system where it's false, and then they like see what happens from there. And yeah, I don't know. I feel like it is kind of like postmodern in a way, just in the sense that it kind of undermines, you know, faith in like this like mathematical project, like, you know, science itself maybe, where it's like, okay, or well, maybe not science itself, but like these very, I guess, reason-based, like, okay, there's some sort of like underlying like truth to the world that we can get to through like, you know, continued effort, something like that. Which, you know, my definitions are a bit rusty to be honest, so I don't know. But I just thought it's interesting stuff to think about. But yeah, so here, I think it's interesting to also think about the context of like Gödel himself, and, you know, what his life was like, what he went through while he was, you know, proving all this, and like why he like chose to go about it in the way he did. And so, yeah, so basically he grew up in like the Austrian Empire, but during like after World War I, the city where he was living and where he grew up, it became part of the Czech Republic, but it was still like an Austrian sort of majority, and so he kind of felt isolated and like, alone in this like new sort of like state that he like now resided in because it was majority Czech, and then throughout his life he kind of just was like a recluse, and he like towards the end of it he really just started to like kind of okay, so he had to like leave Austria when the Nazis came, and then he like started talking about like he went to America and he started talking about this, which I thought was funny because it's very topical, but he towards the later part of his life too, he really started to suffer from this obsessive fear of being poisoned, where basically it came from like when he was like a student, one of his professors, their student actually like murdered him. So there's a lot of there are a lot of crazy stuff going on here. But yeah, like ever since then he had this like fear that like he would be poisoned, and all the food that like he was given, he had to like check it, and like he wouldn't want to eat a lot of it, and so like near the end of his life, like oh there you go. He weighed 65 pounds, which is crazy because like, damn bro, like what? Like that's insane. And yeah, he ended up dying from hunger because he didn't want to eat any food that was given to him because he thought it was poison. And so I feel like that's kind of a part of that. I also include this because I feel like it kind of ties in like a weird way to the transition from like modernism to postmodernism, because this did also happen like during World War II, which is kind of interesting. And like, I don't know, I feel like there's something to be said about like this guy who was like very dedicated to like a sort of like modernist effort ended up like kind of going crazy and like and he proved this thing that was kind of crazy too. So yeah, but this is pretty much where I get off. There's like a little more stuff here. This is mostly for we can talk about this too. I guess a few of you maybe know about the halting problem, I don't know, but this is just kind of a different proof of the incompleteness theorem that's like a little more comprehensible, but you also need to like know the halting problem, so but yeah, I don't know, I could talk more about it later, I guess, so yeah.
Email Bogdan Friday.
Yeah. Oh, and then there's also this, whatever, we don't need to talk about this, I just thought it was interesting. Yeah. I just, whatever. Thank you guys.
Do you want to do a question?
Yeah. Any questions? Any thoughts? Any, criticism on me not knowing anything about, literary theory or
the like formulation to show that real numbers is a larger set than natural numbers and integers reminded me a lot of like the contrarian language and
contrarian language?
Like, I'm trying to see if I can remember this. It has to do with like the concept of a non-context free language. Like that was the basic example that was given in CS 181 of a Turing recognizable but not context free.
Oh, interesting. Yeah, I forgot about that, but that's interesting. I'll review that with you later.
I feel like this is an example of the same arc that we've seen in so many different fields. We had it with like Newton. People thought that the world was a started clock that would play out until its natural end.
Yeah,
Which
exactly.
question with Einstein.
Yeah.
And you had the same, like the word formalism occurred and reoccurred in literature as well, as people tried to define systems of reviewing literature that ended up being overturned because you can't do that with literature. Do you know anything about if those different fields, and you've also talked about politics, like what would you say of how they interacted or overlapped or sort of influenced one another?
Well, yeah, this is kind of exactly what brought me to this topic of Gödel's incompleteness theorem in the first place, because of this sort of like overarching current in like the late 19th century and the early 20th century. That this is a very interesting time where like so many truths that were just held to be like self-evident about the world, or at least in Western circles, obviously, were just discovered to be like, you know, either on like shaky ground or just completely false. And I think that this is a very, very interesting case of that because, I mean, it's math. Like, math is like, it's math. I mean, it's not like some theory like evolution where it's like, okay, we observed a bunch of birds on these islands and like, okay, we see that like, you know, and you can dig up all these fossils and like, you know, form this like theory based on empirical evidence, and then, you know, some people can like provide evidence to refute that or something. It's like, no, it's math, bro. Like, this is like literally the whole point of math is that for thousands of years, like, you would literally build on the theorems of like those that came hundreds of years before you, and their results would still be as equally valid as like the ones that you're doing right now. Like, literally, like Euclid's Elements is still like a valid like text even, you know, 2,200 years later, or 400 anyway. Like, yeah, so, you know, it's I agree. Like, there's a big overlap between this and sort of like, you know, relativity and like things like that, where like I just wanted, basically the overall like thesis of this like presentation is that this incompleteness theorem was kind of one of the events in this sort of turn of the century movement that happened, and I just kind of wanted to look at it because it is in this most like august, I guess, of like, you know, problem solving that is mathematics and like science. So yeah.
Well, I guess I will take it from here.
Thank you
Thank
very
you.
much.
Thank you everyone for coming. I learned a lot, and I hope that you learned a lot too, despite all of the confusion and
Yeah, sorry.
No. And I don't currently. I want these to be a weekly thing. Bogdan obviously knows a lot about Godel, and a lot of
I didn't
you
go
know.
forward, to be fair, but yeah.
A lot of you know a lot about other things, and I would really like this to be almost a weekly series. However, I don't have other lectures lined up as of yet. I have friends who are like, yeah, I'm gonna think about it. So if you have thought about it and would like to give a lecture, then you are more than welcome to, and I would love to work with you to host a space like this for you, or something that more specifically fits your needs. So thank you guys for coming.